Prison violence psychology. What really triggers fights behind bars? Behind every prison fight is a moment, often just a few seconds, where the human brain is pushed past its breaking point. Sometimes it's fear. Sometimes it's pressure. Sometimes it's the desperate need to look stronger than you feel. And in these hidden seconds, behind steel doors and controlled movements, psychology becomes more dangerous than any weapon. This documentary contains descriptions of prison conditions and violence for educational purposes based on verified sources. Viewer discretion is advised. For more deep research of prison documentary like this, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Prisons are built to control people, but they also create conditions that challenge the human mind in extreme ways. Researchers from the National Institute of Justice, the American Psychological Association, and prison scholars like Craig Haney and John Irwin all point to the same truth. Violence inside a correctional facility rarely starts with the punch. It starts with the pressure. In this documentary, we break down what those pressures are. Not through sensationalism, not through exaggeration, but through real psychological frameworks, real inmate reactions, and real environments where survival instincts override everything else. This isn't about glorifying violence. It's about understanding why it happens, and what those moments reveal about the human mind under extreme confinement. The pressure cooker mindset. Every inmate enters prison with one thing in common: an elevated threat response. According to APA findings, chronic uncertainty activates the brain's survival circuits more intensely than short-term fear. In prison, uncertainty never ends. Inside a crowded unit, a simple routine, standing in line, walking to chow, returning to your cell, becomes a psychological test. Not because of physical danger alone, but because the brain begins reading every movement, every voice, every stare as a potential threat. A former inmate interviewed in a Chicago crime lab study described it like this. You walk around with your shoulders tight. You don't even know you're doing it. It's just your body saying, stay ready. Psychologists call this hypervigilance, and Craig Haney notes it becomes a default survival mode in many incarcerated people. But hypervigilance has consequences. When the mind constantly scans for danger, even harmless signals can be misread as hostile. A bumped shoulder, a delayed response, a tone of voice that sounds a little too sharp. None of these would trigger the average person outside. But inside a pressured, tightly controlled environment, the nervous system reacts before logic has time to catch up. This is how violence can come from moments that weren't even intended as confrontations. Not because people are naturally violent, but because the environment repeatedly trains the brain to anticipate danger, even when the danger isn't real. That is the pressure cooker mindset. A psychological world where fight or flight is always 1 second away, and the difference between the two becomes thinner every day. The invisible triggers. Not all prison conflicts begin with anger. Many begin with misinterpretation, a psychological trap the APA describes as threat attribution, where stressful environments cause people to assume danger even when none exists. Inside a correctional facility, these misread signals become invisible tripwires. A quiet look held 1 second too long. An inmate not moving fast enough during count. Someone sitting at a table they never sit at. Small things. Forgettable things. Yet, in prison psychology, they can mean everything. A study referenced by the National Institute of Justice found that over 40% of inmate altercations start from perceived disrespect rather than actual conflict. It's not about ego. It's about survival. Because respect in this environment is not politeness. It is predictability, something the human brain desperately needs when everything else is uncertain. When predictability disappears, the mind fills in the gaps with the worst-case scenario. Inmates interviewed by John Irwin explained it this way. You don't wait to see what someone meant. Waiting gets you hurt. So you assume the worst and react first. This is not impulse. It is a learned adaptation to chaos. One inmate described how his worst fight began with something as harmless as a missing bar of soap. No threats. No arguments. Just a moment where stress plus uncertainty plus past experiences created a psychological equation that ended in conflict. He wasn't fighting over soap. He was fighting over what he believed the soap meant. Test, a message, a sign of weakness. That's the invisible trigger. Not the event itself, but the meaning the brain attaches to the event, shaped by fear, routine, and the relentless pressure of confinement. In prison, the human mind becomes the interpreter of danger. And it does not always interpret correctly. Identity as armor. In the free world, identity is personal. In prison, identity becomes protection. Psychologists studying incarceration, especially the work of Craig Haney, found that many inmates adopt roles or behaviors that don't reflect who they truly are, but who they must appear to be to avoid becoming targets. It's not performance. It's armor. Some inmates act tougher than they feel. Some act colder than they truly are. Some isolate themselves. Some align with groups they never imagined joining outside. All of these behaviors share one psychological purpose: to create a version of yourself that discourages confrontation. A former inmate in a California Department of Corrections study described it simply. You build a mask. You wear it because the place demands it. This mask is a survival tool, but it comes with consequences. The more pressure someone feels to maintain that identity, the more fragile it becomes. And when identity feels threatened, the brain reacts as if the entire self is under attack. A harmless joke can feel like a challenge. A correctional officer giving an order can feel like a public test. A rumor, true or not, can shift an inmate's sense of safety overnight. The APA's research on role consistency stress explains this. When a person must maintain a protective identity at all times, even normal interactions become psychological battlegrounds. For some inmates, this pressure becomes so intense that even minor tension can crack the mask. One incarcerated man interviewed by a Chicago crime lab researcher said he got into his worst conflict because someone laughed in a way that felt directed at him. There was no threat, no insult, no confrontation, just a moment where his internal identity, his armor, felt exposed. Behind bars, identity isn't just who you are. It's the shield between stability and chaos. And when that shield feels weak, the mind can react with sudden, defensive aggression, not out of dominance, but out of fear that the mask might slip. This is the psychology of identity under confinement. A constant effort to appear unbreakable, even when the human mind is under tremendous pressure. When survival overrides logic, every human brain has a limit, a point where stress overwhelms reasoning. In the outside world, people reach this point during emergencies, accidents, or moments of intense fear. In prison, that psychological limit is tested every single day. Studies referenced by the National Institute of Justice show that environments with constant noise, overcrowding, and restricted movement elevate cortisol, the body's stress hormone, far beyond normal levels. When cortisol stays high for too long, the brain shifts into a mode psychologists call reactive survival. This is when the thinking brain slows down and the instinctive brain takes control. One former inmate interviewed for a correctional psychology project described it like this. I wasn't thinking anymore. I was just responding to whatever felt dangerous. This mindset develops slowly. Nights of interrupted sleep days spent anticipating conflict hours locked in a cell with no escape from your own thoughts, moments of unpredictability that build without release. Each layer adds pressure to the nervous system. By the time a conflict happens, many inmates aren't reacting to that moment. They're reacting to months of accumulated tension. This psychological overload explains why small situations can escalate so quickly. A misunderstanding turns into a heated moment. A heated moment turns into a threat. And the brain, already pushed to its limit, defaults to its most basic programming: protect yourself. Craig Haney's research calls this chronic threat activation, a state where people interpret even neutral situations through the lens of self-preservation. This isn't an excuse. It's a reaction wired into the human nervous system when it believes survival is at stake. A correctional officer once told researchers that the most unpredictable inmates weren't the angriest ones. They were the overwhelmed ones. The ones who had reached the point where logic no longer broke through the noise. In this psychological state, violence becomes less about intent. and more about an instinctive response triggered by stress, fear, and a brain conditioned to anticipate danger at all times. This is where survival overrides logic. Not because people want it to, but because constant pressure reshapes the way the mind interprets the world. The power struggle inside the mind. Prison is built on rules, written rules, unwritten rules, and the unspoken rules every inmate learns fast. But the real struggle is not just between people. It's inside the mind. Researchers in correctional psychology explain that prisons create a unique mental battleground where control becomes a form of self-protection. Not control over others, but control over yourself, your space, your emotions, your routine. In an environment where choices are limited, the human brain begins to cling to the few things it can still manage. A former incarcerated man described it in an APA interview. When you don't control anything, the little things become big things. And this is where the internal power struggle starts. An inmate loses a seat he normally uses. A cellmate disrupts a routine. An officer changes the schedule without warning. To an outside observer, these moments seem insignificant. To the brain under confinement, they threaten the only stability it has. According to the Chicago Crime Lab, this need for psychological control becomes a survival mechanism. The mind creates structure so it can stay grounded. But when that structure cracks, even slightly, stress spikes. This is the same mechanism seen in soldiers returning from combat or individuals living in long-term high-stress environments. The brain defends the patterns that keep it stable. If those patterns break unexpectedly, the nervous system reacts defensively. One man interviewed in a correctional behavior study said the moment he felt most on edge wasn't during conflict. It was when the routine suddenly changed without explanation. It felt like the ground moved under me. I didn't know what was coming next. That psychological shock, losing control of the little structure you build inside chaos, can trigger fear, anger, or hyperreactive behavior. Not because someone wants conflict, but because the mind depends on predictability to feel safe. In prisons, predictability is rare. So the fight isn't just between inmates. It's between the human brain and an environment that constantly disrupts stability. This internal power struggle, trying to hold onto some sense of control, creates a fragile mental balance where even small disruptions can feel explosive. When fear becomes routine. In most people's lives, fear is temporary. A moment on a dark street. A close call on the highway. A sudden loud noise that makes your heart jump. For inmates, fear becomes something entirely different. A routine emotion woven into everyday life. Psychologists studying long-term confinement, especially Craig Haney and NIJ-funded researchers, explain that when fear becomes constant, the brain no longer reacts to it the same way. Instead of creating an urgent burst of adrenaline, it becomes a slow, steady pulse beneath everything you do. A former inmate interviewed by the Chicago Crime Lab put it in stark terms. You stop feeling scared. You start living like fear is normal. This shift changes how the mind processes danger. When fear is temporary, people think clearly. When fear is constant, the brain adapts by becoming emotionally numb. This numbness is not coldness, it's exhaustion. An exhausted mind is more reactive, more defensive, more vulnerable to misreading the intentions of others. One inmate explained that after years inside, he could no longer tell whether he was actually threatened or just drained. I reacted fast because I couldn't trust what I was feeling anymore. This emotional fatigue mirrors findings from APA research on chronic stress. When the brain is flooded with fear for too long, it stops differentiating between small threats and big ones. In prison, this creates a dangerous psychological cycle. Fear becomes routine, emotional sharpness fade, misjudgments increase, defensiveness rises, conflict becomes more likely. Not because people want to be violent, but because the emotional signals that normally slow things down become dull. Correctional officers interviewed in NIJ reports described many inmates not as angry, but as overwhelmed by long-term fear they could no longer feel clearly. This numbness is the silent fuel behind many prison conflicts. A mind so accustomed to danger that it no longer distinguishes the immediate moment from the long shadow of stress behind it. The breaking point, no. Long before any confrontation happens in prison, something else breaks first. The mind's ability to hold everything together. Researchers from the American Psychological Association describe this moment as cognitive overload, a state where stress, fear, routine pressure, and constant alertness pile up until the brain simply stops processing things clearly. Inmates often don't recognize when this breaking point is approaching. It happens quietly, gradually, then suddenly. Small frustrations build on top of each other. A night of poor sleep, a tense interaction during count, a meal cut short, a rumor spreading across the tier, a loud argument 2 cells down that keeps replaying in your head. Each one is manageable by itself. But stacked together, they become something heavier. A weight the brain is no longer equipped to organize. A former incarcerated man interviewed in a CDCR-based research project described it this way. It wasn't the big problems that got to me. It was the 100 little ones I never got a break from. This psychological fatigue is where the breaking point forms. According to the NIJ, inmates experiencing chronic cognitive strain become more vulnerable to sudden emotional surges. Not because they want conflict, but because the mental load exceeds their capacity to respond calmly. One man explained that the moment before his worst confrontation wasn't explosive, it was empty. I didn't feel angry. I felt nothing. And that scared me more. That numbness is the red flag researchers warn about. When emotional signals go quiet, people stop recognizing the warnings inside themselves. The Chicago Crime Lab calls this state emotional burnout under confinement, where the nervous system, tired of being on high alert, loses its ability to filter reactions. In that mental fog, a harmless comment can feel like a threat. A normal disagreement can feel like disrespect. A simple movement can feel unpredictable. It's not the event that causes the conflict. It's the exhausted mind trying to interpret the event through months or years of accumulated strain. The breaking point is not a single moment. It is the result of hundreds of psychological cuts the environment inflicts over time. When people talk about fights inside prison, they often describe the moment of conflict. But the real story is the invisible journey the mind takes long before anything happens. A journey most inmates walk alone. And when that breaking point comes, it's not aggression that leads the moment. It's exhaustion. Understanding the mind behind the walls. Prison violence is often seen as sudden, explosive, or unpredictable. But as we've uncovered throughout this documentary, the truth is far more human and far more psychological. Behind every confrontation is a mind shaped by pressure, a nervous system trained by fear, a routine disrupted by uncertainty, an identity worn like armor, a breaking point no one notices until it's past. The National Institute of Justice, the American Psychological Association, and decades of correctional psychology research all point to the same conclusion. Violence behind bars is rarely about anger alone. It's about the environment that reshapes how the human brain reacts to stress, threat, and survival. Understanding this doesn't excuse it. It explains it. So we can see the person behind the behavior, and the psychology behind the moment. And if we don't understand it, we can't change it. Prisons don't just confine people. They confine emotions. They confine fear. They confine pressure. And when those forces collide, the mind reacts in ways that reveal just how powerful and fragile the human psyche can be. This documentary isn't about glorifying violence. It's about revealing the psychological reality that exists behind concrete walls and steel doors. A reality most people never see, but everyone should understand. If this deep dive into the psychology of prison violence opened your eyes, there's more coming. More documentaries, more real analysis, and more insight into the hidden human stories behind confinement. To support the channel and help this documentary reach more viewers, subscribe, turn on notifications, and drop a comment with the next prison psychology topic you want explored. Your engagement helps this channel grow and helps these stories get the attention they deserve. See you in the next documentary.